Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Pat Furlong, President of PPMD, and I'm going to introduce you to PPMD's work to speed responsible access to new therapies for Duchenne and other rare, serious, and life-threatening disorders. I hope some of you are familiar with the white paper, Putting Patients First, the recommendations to speed responsible access to new therapies for Duchenne muscular dystrophy and other rare and life-saving or life-threatening neurologic disorders. And so with that, we're going to begin the webinar. So the goals for today's webinar are to review current evaluation and approval standards at the FDA, to discuss opportunities to improve the review process that have been created by the passage of the FDA's Safety and Innovation Act, FDASIA, and to discuss how you can contribute to our success in advocating for more effective evaluation and review practices. So why are we engaging in this area? Well, I can tell you, when I look at the pipeline that we have, it really takes my breath away. Keep in mind that my boys were diagnosed in 1984, and there was no pipeline, there was no interest, and certainly industry was not present. So after years of advocacy and investment in research to promote the development of new therapies for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, we're closer than ever to potential FDA approval of the first ever treatment for Duchenne. As illustrated on this chart, there are numerous compounds under investigation for treatment of Duchenne. A number of these investigational therapies are in phase 2 or 3 clinical trials and are soon approaching consideration for review. This has created enormous hope for all of us, for all of our patients, all of our boys, and all of our families. But this hope is tempered by the knowledge that current review and evaluation procedures at the FDA have created significant hurdles to the approval of first-ever therapies that are designed to treat these serious and life-threatening disorders. So today, we're going to walk through the policy recommendations made in Putting Patients First, which was recently released by PPMD, and are designed to improve the FDA's practices for reviewing and evaluating new therapies for these disorders such as Duchenne muscular dystrophy. The recommendations you'll see are going to be broad. They're broad enough to improve the review processes for any disorder that is similar to Duchenne, life-threatening or serious, as these terms are defined under laws and regulations, but they are not explained in the paper, and they are looked through the lens of Duchenne. The recommendations focus not on changing the law, but on changing the way the FDA carries out the review process and evaluation of the new drugs under existing law. In other words, they are regulatory policy recommendations. All right, so what is regulatory policy? I don't know about you, but this is a wonderful conversation that we're having now on regulatory policy when none existed before. And so this was never important to me when I was in school, but somehow it's become front and center to all of us. So when Congress passes a law, it's signed by the President, and then it's implemented by an agency such as the FDA within the executive branch. To carry out programs authorized by law, agencies issue regulations, which are the rules that have the force of law and dictate the specifics of how a program is implemented. So during the process of creating these rules, there are opportunities to impact the way the rules are written and the way the programs are carried out. The regulatory making process is a formal process, and it's much like the legislative process. There are opportunities for interested parties to weigh in on the form that the rules should take. So the process for regulatory policy making is outlined under a law called the Administrative Procedures Act, or like everything in Washington, D.C., has an acronym, the APA, which established the process by which government agencies such as the FDA can issue rules and regulations to carry out its programs. So under the APA, all proposed rules must be published in the Federal Register. This is a freely available online publication that lists all the proposed rules and final issues issued by government agencies. It's viewed at the website listed, which is federalregister.gov. So when a new rule is proposed, there's generally an opportunity for interested parties to submit comments on the rule. The comment period is designed to give those who will be likely to be affected by these rules to provide an opportunity for feedback to the agency about what that impact will be for them, and is designed to improve the final version of the rule. So public comments you have to look at are just that. Anyone can submit a public comment. Once comments have been received and reviewed, the agency then issues a final rule. And this is really a slow process, as most government processes are, but the outcome of such a comment can have significant and enormous impact. So why do we see a need to improve the drug evaluation process? Well, to date, the FDA has fallen short in using its existing regulatory authority to review drugs for serious and life-threatening disorders, and especially in reviewing drugs intended to treat rare disorders. As we'll see in more detail later in the presentation, very few therapies for rare disorders have been reviewed or approved under the accelerated approval pathway, which was designed for evaluating serious and life-threatening disorders like Duchenne, where there is a significant high unmet medical need. So unfortunately, there aren't any clear standards for what criteria should be considered when reviewing evidence of clinical benefit under the accelerated approval pathway. And there are a lot of variations in the flexibility applied from one reviewing division to another. So finally, the FDA hasn't really adequately incorporated patients and caregivers into the risk-benefit process. So we really need to have a role there in that risk-benefit evaluation. Next slide, Ryan. Because the recommendations in putting patients first are designed to impact the use of accelerated approval for reviewing therapies for rare disease indications, we have to take a minute to review the concept of accelerated approval. As the name indicates, the accelerated approval pathway was created in order to speed access to new therapies for serious and life-threatening disorders like we're looking at in Duchenne. Initially, the accelerated approval pathway was created in regulation issued by the FDA to respond to the AIDS crisis. The regulation allowed for the approval of a drug intended to treat AIDS, in that case, with the high unmet medical need based on a surrogate endpoint. So what are surrogate endpoints? Surrogate endpoints are measurements that have been shown to be or can be considered to be reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. The patient often doesn't even know about the surrogate. In other words, it doesn't affect their life in terms of what their knowledge of, in this case, dystrophin or a blood marker. They don't even know. They're unaware of this change. They might be aware of the change in clinical, but they're not aware of the biomarker. Examples include the measurement of blood pressure or cholesterol levels in treating cardiovascular disease. The idea is to speed up the traditional clinical process, which can take much longer if demonstrated clinical benefit is used as the endpoint. In essence, accelerated approval is a response to the need to strike a better balance between clinical certainty and the need to speed patients' access to a potentially life-saving drug. Although accelerated approval was created by regulations issued by the FDA, Congress codified the accelerated approval and gave it the force of law with the passage of the FDA Modernization Act of 1997. Of note, this law states that the approval of a new drug based on a surrogate endpoint is appropriate when the evidence demonstrates that the surrogate is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. This law also reinforced the need for greater flexibility on the part of the FDA by allowing data from one adequate and well-controlled clinical trial to serve as the basis for approval, whereas at least two adequate and well-controlled trials had previously been required by the FDA. So Congress's validation of the accelerated approval pathway within FDASIA, another one of those acronyms, was an endorsement of the need for more flexible approaches to speed patient access to these life-saving therapies. The regulatory flexibility outlined under the accelerated approval holds real promise as a potential tool to speed access to treatments for rare disorders. Many of the characteristics of these rare disorders present challenges that can make approval under the traditional approval process impossible or incredibly time-consuming, time we don't have. First, by definition, rare disorders will affect small numbers of patients. For example, in Duchenne, we know Duchenne affects 1 in 35 to 1 in 5,000 males. These small patient populations make clinical trial recruitment difficult sometimes, and in addition, there's often variation in the clinical expression of the disease, and we know that in Duchenne because it varies clinically in families, and the progression varies in families, which may manifest itself slowly over years, making it difficult to tease out clinical benefit in a reasonable time frame, which further complicates the clinical trial process. Other hurdles to approval of new drugs under the traditional pathway include a lack of natural history data, lack of prior studies, and lack of well-validated endpoints. The accelerated approval pathway, then, represents a critically important tool to speed responsible access to new therapies for rare diseases. So, unfortunately, in practice, there's been a very uneven application of the use of accelerated approval since its inception more than 2 decades ago. And you can see from this pie chart exactly what we're looking at. So the vast majority of drugs approved under this accelerated approval pathway, 79 out of 90 of them, have been for cancer or HIV/AIDS or inhalation anthrax. So just one therapy for a rare disorder was granted under accelerated approval within the first 16 years of its existence. So in practice, the concentration of approvals in oncology and HIV/AIDS has been largely explained by the existence of well-validated surrogate endpoints in those fields, such as progression-free survival or viral load counts. However, an accelerated approval does not require the use of a previously validated surrogate endpoint. It only requires that the surrogate endpoint can be shown to be reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. All right. So we have such a rich pipeline of potential treatments in Duchenne, but past experience indicating the odds of approval of these compounds are likely to be diminished by the FDA's reticence to utilize the accelerated approval pathway and apply regulatory flexibility in evaluating new therapies for rare disorders. PPMD has begun to undertake efforts to influence the regulatory review process. So in December of 2011, the PPMD Board of Directors released a statement of principles outlining important issues in drug development and evaluation for Duchenne. They felt this was essential because the conversation has now changed, and these are the challenges that face us currently. So the principles that state that we applaud the efforts to create and use more responsible trial designs to overcome hurdles posed by rare disorders, that we want to advocate for a more substantive and systematic approach to incorporating patients' perspective in the evaluation of the risk and benefit, that we recognize the importance of the development of new endpoints, and particularly for non-ambulatory patients. We recognize that boys that don't fit the inclusion criteria based on loss of function are really waiting too long for the ability to either participate in trials or access treatments. We endorse the use of modified or staged approval for some candidate compounds, and we reinforce the urgent need to access these new treatments. We know that doing nothing does harm, and we know that waiting for years means the difference between walking and not, breathing and not, living and not. So together, those principles guided PPMD's efforts to improve the regulatory review practices as they're applied to potential therapies for Duchenne. So, we met with the FDA several times to discuss the review practices. We met with Dr. Temple, Dr. Katz, Dr. Farkas, Dr. Ann Pariser, Dr. Banks, and others. And the issues that we focused on at these meetings were several. One is we wanted to talk about Duchenne. We wanted to give them an overview. And this would include information on prevalence and severity, the lack of treatments to halt or reverse progression. And that brought us to a discussion of risk tolerance in Duchenne, because Dr. Katz specifically said to us, patients with rare disease say that the risk tolerance is different than in common diseases, and we agreed. And he said, but we don't have any real data to understand that. So we had a conversation about existing outcomes as well, such as the 6-minute walk test and the need to develop new endpoints to assess non-ambulatory function. We included the need to talk about adaptive trial design, because this is really going to be important for all rare disorders. And we wanted also to really tell them how much we support the use of accelerated or conditional approval for the review of therapies in rare disorders, meeting the criteria of serious or life-threatening. We fully recognize that conditional approval is used in Europe and not typically in the United States. So when we left the meeting, we thought we had a new understanding of the challenges and the potential ways that we might respond to the process. All right. So, to help ensure change, as well as to help ensure this change, as well as changes to improve the review of drugs for rare and serious life-threatening disorders like Duchenne, we joined with advocates across the rare disease community in 2012 to advocate for changes in the law that would speed responsible access. So we participated in lots of conversations about PDUFA 5 and certainly the FDASIA as well. And we joined advocates from around the world and around the country on the 5th reauthorization of PDUFA, or the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. We thought it presented an opportunity to include such changes in the laws as really to include the patient and the patient's view in the disease. So we were proud to work with our partners, and we were happy to see this bill signed into law. One of the clear areas where the FDA review practices could be improved is a better and more systematic approach to incorporating patient and caregiver preferences in the overall assessment of benefit and risk. To help ensure that substantial data on this information was available for Duchenne, we've undertaken an effort to collect and analyze this data for use in the evaluation process. We can do our part to provide information about patient and caregiver preferences, but we also need to ensure that changes are made at the FDA to better evaluate this data and include the patient voice in the drug development and evaluation process. For those of you who participated in our risk tolerance survey instrument, it is now under initial pilot analysis with Dr. Bridges and Holly P.A. and others, and we'll be able to share some of that information along the way. Keep in mind we were going to bring that survey instrument back, and we'll ask all of you to participate in the risk tolerance as we prepare to deliver this to the FDA. So, in the summer of 2012, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act was signed into law, so we were happy about that. The passage of the law created some important opportunities to improve the review and evaluation of drugs for Duchenne and other rare disorders, and the implementation of these provisions over the next year and into the future are going to provide important opportunities for PPMD and other rare disease advocates to engage in efforts to improve the FDA's review and evaluation process. So, what exactly do the relevant provisions of the law do to improve the review practice? So first, FDASIA created an opportunity to enhance the use of accelerated approval. So FDASIA created this opportunity for us to enhance the use of accelerated approval for rare diseases such as Duchenne. So advocates in the rare disease community have been pressing for Congress to do changes to better balance the desire for strong safety and efficacy data against the need for patients to have access to new therapies more quickly. I think this is important for all of us. So the reauthorization of PDUFA last year provided an opening to incorporate changes under the law. So Section 901 of FDASIA is designed to enhance accelerated access to new therapies for patients with serious and life-threatening disorders. It created breakthrough therapy designation. And when I spoke to Dr. Katz about this, he says this is something that kind of hits you between the eyes, and it directly references the need to better utilize the accelerated approval pathway to evaluate and approve therapies for rare disorders. This section under the law also directs the FDA to adapt to incorporate recent advances in science, such as personalized medicine, and the law directs the FDA to consider a broad range of scientific evidence, such as biomarkers, to support the evaluation of whether surrogate endpoints are reasonably likely to predict benefit. And I think reasonably likely is a word that's going to be in our head continuously through this process. So, another aspect of FDASIA that holds promise of improving the evaluation of therapies for serious and life-threatening rare disorders is the commitment of the FDA to improve the incorporation of patients' risk tolerances into review and the evaluation process. So the FDA will draft and is expected to release a 5-year plan to better incorporate the patient perspective, and they will undertake a public process. And they've identified, as you know, 20 disease areas. Duchenne is not within those 20, where a more systematic and expansive approach to obtaining patient perspective is needed. So this is a right step. I know we all wish Duchenne was included in there, but it's actually not sufficient. So patient perspectives on appropriate risk tolerance profiles have been shown to vary in relation to the morbidity and mortality associated with a particular disorder. And every evaluation of a new therapy should consider the assessment of benefit risk in the context of the specific disorder. So still, the process will create an opportunity to make improvements in the FDA review and evaluation process. And PPMD has participated in 3 of those meetings to give feedback on the process. However, this also further explains PPMD's efforts to collect data on risk tolerance in the community, because we know we don't have any time to waste. To implement these sections, the FDA is required to release guidance to clarify the standard of evidence necessary under the accelerated approval pathway as amended by FDASIA. In addition, the law calls for a series of public meetings, reports, and other guidance documents, many of which present an opportunity for regulatory policy engagement by PPMD in the community and other advocates across rare diseases. So we wanted to let you know how we're engaging and what are our goals. So recognizing there are opportunities created by FDASIA to address existing frustrations within the evaluation and review process at the FDA, we convened an expert advisory committee to review the law and issue some recommendations. These recommendations build on our prior efforts to improve the FDA review and evaluation process. The Expert Advisory Committee, also we called them the Advisory Committee on Policies to Promote Responsible Access to New Therapies, was organized to identify recommendations to improve the review and evaluation of drugs for Duchenne and other life-threatening disorders, and to contribute to the issuance of a white paper. To ensure balanced and effective recommendations, we invited the participation of a group of leading authorities from a range of sectors to include the nonprofit, academic, medical, legal, and pharmaceutical arenas. So some of these folks you're going to recognize. Rich Finkel, Chief of the Division of Neurology in the Department of Pediatrics at Nemours Children's Hospital in Orlando, Florida. Dr. Marlene Hafner, retired Admiral, U.S. Public Health Service. You might remember Marlene was head of Orphan Products Division for more than 20 years. Dr. Emil Kakis. Dr. Emil Kakis, you know from Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, which is dedicated to accelerating biotech innovation for rare disease treatments through a science-driven public policy. With Dr. Kakis on a number of areas, he's also was the Chief Medical Officer for BioMarin. He's the President and Chief Executive Officer at Ultragenyx Pharmaceuticals. Lori Letback, Senior Vice President and Global Health Development for the Critical Care franchise at Novartis. Dr. Letback has special expertise in the successful use of accelerated approval pathways, and prior to her current role, she served as program head for Gleevec. You know Dr. Lee Sweeney quite well, I think. He's now director of the Center for Orphan Disease Research and Therapy at University of Pennsylvania. He serves as our board chair of our scientific research. Dr. Susan Weiner, founder and president of the Children's Cause of Cancer Advocacy, a leading national education and advocacy group. She's dedicated her life to advancing treatments for childhood cancer and ensuring quality care for patients, families, and their survivors. So with this really remarkable advisory group in hand, we began having phone calls and discussing what we wanted to do. So we worked collaboratively with the advisory committee, discussed opportunities created by the passage of FDASIA, and identified regulatory policy recommendations which are outlined in Putting Patients First. All of these recommendations are designed to improve the evaluation process in order to strike a more appropriate balance between clinical certainty and access to these life-saving therapies. There are 4 major recommendations advanced by the white paper. First, the FDA should expand the use of accelerated approval for therapies intended to treat rare diseases, especially Duchenne. Second, to achieve an expanded application of accelerated approval, the FDA should expand the scope of acceptable endpoints used as the basis for an approval. Third, the FDA should pilot the use of progressive or adaptive approval. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about where some of these came from in a moment. And finally, the FDA should give greater weight to the demonstrated benefit-risk preferences of patients when making benefit-risk determinations. So the PCAST recommendations. So in the previous slide, we talked about the recommendations, and so 3 of those 4 recommendations, Putting Patients First, echo recommendations made in the September 2012 report to the President on propelling innovation in drug discovery, development, and evaluation. These are recommendations made by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, known as the PCAST, and they represent the thinking of some of the most preeminent experts in the field of drug development and evaluation. The purpose of the report was to support innovation and accelerate the development of new therapies. So we found the PCAST a very useful tool as we began to think about, in the advisory committee, what recommendations would be useful for Duchenne and other rare diseases. So the first recommendation, this is designed to address the FDA's current concentration on the use of accelerated approvals with oncology and HIV/AIDS indications. As FDASIA outlines, there's a need to consider a broader range of surrogate and clinical endpoints using modern scientific tools. The PCAST report summed this instruction up by suggesting that the FDA should expand the use in practice of its authority under the accelerated approval pathway. Recommendation 2. In order to successfully expand the use of accelerated approval pathway in practice, the FDA will need to consider approvals based on a broader range of surrogate and immediate clinical endpoints as outlined in the recommendation. This means that the FDA must be open to an approval based on a novel surrogate endpoint when there is sufficient evidence to meet the bar of, remember that little phrase, reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, taking into account the severity, rarity, and prevalence of the condition and the availability or lack of alternative treatments. And clearly, this seemed to hit us right in the eyes and say this is where Duchenne fits. This is a directive from Congress for the FDA to consider the evidence in a specific context of a disease. As the PCAST explains, this balance strikes a good compromise between clinical certainty and early access to treatments for the patients who need them. Recommendation 3. This urges the FDA to consider piloting adaptive approval for serious and life-threatening disorders like Duchenne with significant unmet medical need. So while many other jurisdictions, such as EMA in Europe and Canada as well, have already outlined procedures for conditional approval of drugs, there is stiff resistance to passing legislation to create a conditional approval pathway in the U.S. However, as the PCAST notes, the FDA could pilot the use of adaptive approval using its existing authority. Such a pilot might result in the identification of potential evidentiary standards, protection of patient safety and rights, and mechanisms to ensure that confirmatory evidence is collected in a timely fashion in order to speed access to therapies for disorders like Duchenne, where we have serious unmet medical need and where each day we lose time with these patients and they lose function. Finally, recommendation 4, the FDA should give greater weight to the patient risk-benefit preferences and caregivers' preferences in the case of pediatric disorders when evaluating drugs. They have to arrive at the appropriate balance with regard to safety and efficacy and the patient access to new treatments, and this is a difficult task, and there are variations in acceptable risk tolerance and preferences from one individual to another. However, it's been shown that disorders with high morbidity and mortality are associated with a greater level of risk tolerance, and the FDA must evaluate benefit and risk in the context of the disorder, that the drug is designed to treat. So as outlined in FDASIA, the consideration should include the severity and lethality of the disorder as well as the availability or lack of availability to approved treatments. And I think, again, Duchenne fits right in here because, as you know, the only intervention we have is steroids at this moment, and we need much better treatments for our sons. So, to advocate for the adoption of these recommendations, we have completed an initial launch of the white paper to key audiences such as policymakers, FDA officials, rare disease advocates such as NORD, Genetic Alliance, RARE, and patients and families in order to outline the policy recommendation or our asks, if you will. Part of the launch of the white paper, we're conducting meetings with the decision makers to discuss our recommendations as well. We're sharing the recommendations with our allies and engaging them in supporting the white paper, as well as contributing to our allies' efforts into improve their evaluation process for their disease. We participate in the working group convened by the Every Life Foundation, which is Emil Kakis, for instance, which will result in model guidance on the implementation of the amended accelerated approval provision. And finally, we'll take advantage of all official opportunities to participate in shaping regulatory policy, such as submitting public comments on draft guidance. We will be speaking at public meetings held by the FDA, and we'll be discussing our goals with members of Congress. So there are some key opportunities to participate in the regulatory process in 2013. So draft guidance outlining consideration for the use of accelerated approval and evaluating therapies for serious life-threatening and rare disorders is expected by July 1st, although I'm understanding it may be somewhat delayed. So we're going to review the guidance, we're going to draft public comments, and we're going to share them with everyone we can, and then we'll submit them at the website, which is www.regulations.gov. So the FDA also plans to hold a public meeting on the use of biomarkers in October, and I think we'll all be participating in that one, and certainly PPMD will be front and center. The FDA will release its draft plan on improving the incorporation of patients' risk-benefit preferences in the evaluation process in December, We're going to review the plan and submit public comments. Keep in mind that the risk tolerance survey, again, as I mentioned, is in review, and we will have some very significant data to share with the FDA. As the FDA issues draft guidance, we're going to take steps and respond and participate in the process, and we're going to keep everyone involved and included and hopefully actively participating. So here's how you can help. So you might consider submitting public comments to the FDA. Keep in mind anyone can participate, so your comments are going to be heard and listened to. You can participate in the FDA's patient representative program and other opportunities to provide your feedback on risk tolerance. We're also going to we're talking to Dr. Bridges, and we're going to revamp probably the risk tolerance survey a bit after the initial analysis. We really ask you to respond and use the survey instrument so that we have a much broader swath of data to share over time. Also to share your story. Your stories are critically important. There's a piece on the FDA website where you can share your story, and also within the survey instrument. So share the white paper as broadly as you can. We would love that. So I think the more we share and the more we stick to the same message, the better, more likely we're going to have success. Advocating for the adoption of the recommendations is a significant undertaking, but it's one that has the greatest potential to help ensure that therapies now in the pipeline are afforded an evaluation by the FDA that accounts for the severity and lethality of Duchenne. And it takes the patient's risk tolerance preferences into consideration. This whole community has worked so incredibly hard to build this very robust and promising pipeline of treatments. It's truly amazing. And now we have to work hard to ensure that they're afforded an appropriate review. So, with that, I'm hopefully prepared for questions. I find the regulations really inspiring, helpful, and really provide opportunities for this community not only to interact, but really to accelerate with the FDA the review process so that we can have access to therapies, our sons can have access to these therapies. So, questions. Ivy. So there's, at the end of the presentation, please repeat the previous slide on what PPMD advocates can do. So these will all be up online, but we can certainly go back to that one. I think I just put that one up.
So if you have questions, please be sure to submit them into the chat box, or you can email us after the webinar. Pat, I have a question that came in. Based on your in-person meetings with the FDA personnel, do you think that their true willingness to include patient-family perspectives of risk-benefit match the agency's stated commitment to doing this?
So I think the agency certainly has a difficult issue, right? There are 7,100 rare diseases, and they have to be, or are expected to be, experts in every one of them, and they're expected to know the stories. The way they know the stories is for us to share them. I can say to you in my meetings with the agency, we talked about, Dr. Katz talked about his sliding scale and where he looks at risk tolerance, and he was talking about Duchenne, and it's the fact that there are, that the lifespan in the last 12 years or so has really increased by 10 years. And so the mean age of death now is expected around 29 and growing, actually, because as you all know, we have men living in their 40s and 50s. So I think when we had this conversation, basically I sort of presented to Dr. Katz, that doesn't make it chronic, right? That makes an individual lose progression over perhaps a longer period of time, although in this particular case we still have this loss of walking in the teenage years, which is a detriment to the individual who experiences the loss of ambulation as well as to the family members who have to make up for that loss of ambulation. But I explained to him that being unable to lift your arm, feed yourself, scrub your teeth, scratch your head, throw your arms around someone you love is also a little death, not only for the person who experiences it and experiences the accompanying social isolation, but also for the family. And I think that in another meeting when I spoke to Dr. Katz and group, they spoke of these little deaths. So I think your stories are important, and I think they are listening, and I think they do make a difference. I was recently in a circumstance where I met Dr. Hamburg, who also commented on the stories she's hearing, that they do make a difference. So I think that they are listening, and I think they are listening and taking that into account. And certainly with the risk tolerance survey, we're able to provide hard data about what families are willing to trade on in terms of risk and benefit, and what families are expecting in these therapies, and how much benefit they want or need. And clearly all of us want treatment or cure, but I think these benefits that we're seeing in some of the data coming out on the drugs are quite impressive. And so I think the willingness to supply data to the FDA in terms of risk and benefit is going to be very important.
Okay, great. Another question that came in, is there any way that parents can help suggest clinical benefit endpoints based on their own experience of what is important to the function of boys or men with Duchenne?
Well, I was just in a meeting yesterday in Washington where the patient-reported outcomes were carrying more and more weight with the FDA. So I know in Duchenne Connect, many of you are registered and share what you're seeing in your son in terms of the survey that is on Duchenne Connect. But I think patient-reported outcomes are going to be important. It clearly is not a validated outcome where we'll be able to say if 3 of the X children are able to roll over in bed, that gets a drug approved. Clearly not. But I think patient-reported outcomes in context are going to be an important and useful tool to help confirm what the evidence is suggesting from a given trial.
Okay, great. There was a question that came in on regulations.gov, how do we actually make comments? I will be posting this in a blog to give people more direction on exactly where to comment, and also information on the new FDA Patient Network site, which we are currently taking a look at.
Great.
Another question came in, is one well-conducted trial, is that enough to establish an acceptable surrogate endpoint?
Well, I think in that we're talking about 2 different things. One, well-conducted trial is enough, is in rare disease sometimes sufficient for an approval, but a clinical trial doesn't establish a surrogate endpoint typically. Surrogate endpoints can be accepted and then validated over time. So yesterday, Mark Walton talked about how surrogate endpoints are used in several different ways, and we're posting a blog about that as well. So one clinical trial, well-controlled, can get you an approval. One clinical trial may establish that the surrogate endpoint is reasonably likely to predict benefit, but it may not be the validated, after one clinical trial, would not be a validated surrogate endpoint. Sorry, tongue-tied here.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, are there plans to share this report, or have you shared this report with members of Congress?
We are sharing the report with members of Congress, and we intend to have some meetings with members of Congress, but clearly our champions on the Hill already have the report and have already reviewed it. FDA members from Janet Woodcock to Dr. Hamburg, Ann Pariser, Larry Bauer, and the Neurology Division have all have the report and have reviewed it.
Great. Okay, unless there are any more questions, this webinar is going to be posted online for those to view afterwards and share with the community, and we will be happy to accept questions via email for those who would like to follow up with us. And Pat, if you want to close this up.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, everyone. This is very challenging to look at FDASIA and PDUFA and try to understand the law and surrogate outcomes. I think as a community we're learning each day, and we're learning step by step and learning the ways we can educate the FDA, we can discuss this high unmet medical need, the urgency, the fact that not treating is causing harm, and the fact that we as a community are willing to accept some risk as these therapies are submitted for their review. And so together I am certain that we will soon see approvals. I'm very hopeful about that and hopeful about the ability to certainly end Duchenne. And so I can't thank you enough for for listening to the webinar and for participating with us. And if you have any other questions, please let us know. If we can help in any way, please share the white paper. Please connect with the FDA, share your stories, answer the questions as the risk tolerance survey comes back, and we will certainly provide update about the risk tolerance data that we are gathering and certainly our interactions with the FDA. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.